Before we talk about royalty, before we talk about fame, before we talk about carefully crafted interviews and perfectly rehearsed smiles, there's a number, a single, quiet, almost invisible number that threatens to tear the entire story apart. Because if that number is wrong, then everything, every speech, every timeline, every emotional confession starts to collapse like a house built on sand. And the most chilling part? The person who knows that number better than anyone alive isn't a journalist, isn't a critic, it's her own sister, the one who was there when it all began.
Things just got a whole load worse for Meghan Markle because her sister Samantha ain't going anywhere.
In my opinion, she would still be a waitress if it wasn't for Dad.
The buzz this morning centers around Meghan Markle's father.
This crisis won't die down until the irrefutable truth comes out.
Actually, it was because of Meghan that it was taken away. Meghan could have had her there if she wanted to have it there. Instead, she wanted to have a bunch of celebrities she barely knew, from the Clooneys to the Beckhams to Elton John to James Gordon to Timbuktu. I mean, it looked like anyone she'd met on the party circuit.
As our fathers, so we have to include the men when we are self-glorifying. You know, there's got to be some acknowledgement there.
Described as a devastating betrayal, this revelation could change everything we thought we knew about the Duchess of Sussex.
I'm going to quote Tom Bauer by saying, he said, look, we all laughed at Samantha and she was right. And everything she said has come true.
When she said, I lost my father, we knew that she didn't lose our dad. She iced our father.
Tragic news coming in. Meghan Markle's father, Thomas Markle, is undergoing leg amputation.
Something like that. So she wasn't even pregnant. It's very weird. And Harry, it was said to Harry, not to her. I mean, she just came in.
All right, I do blame Meghan Markle. Meghan Markle, stain of humanity. Yes, Meghan, and I hope you're watching right now. I hope you're watching, Meghan, because you are the stain of humanity.
See, after Thomas Markle Jr. this week described Meghan Markle as previously having been a, quote, yacht girl, there have been more revelations going viral from the past.
Now pause for a second. Let that sink in, because this isn't just gossip anymore. This is pattern recognition. 3 different voices, 3 separate people, no coordination, no shared script, and yet the same whisper echoing from all sides. Something doesn't add up. The official story says one thing, clean, polished, repeated like a mantra, but then her own father, in a moment that seems so casual, so unguarded, drops a sentence that doesn't fit, and suddenly the timeline cracks.
I thought, what is she not contextually aware? She's trying to hide something. This is really sloppy pool.
Think about that. One sentence, one small slip, but numbers don't lie, people do. If he said 40 years ago in 2018, then what does that really mean? Not 1981, no. It points somewhere else, somewhere earlier, somewhere inconvenient. And now the question isn't whether it was a mistake, the question is, why hasn't it been corrected?
August 4th, 40 years ago, Meghan was born, and she was born.
And here's where it starts getting uncomfortable, because once one piece of the timeline shifts, everything connected to it begins to wobble. Education, career, the so-called struggle years. Suddenly, they're not just vague, they're suspicious. Her own brother steps in, not with hesitation, but with certainty. Not saying she struggled, but saying she didn't even finish.
Thomas Markle Jr., the sister of Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex, has lashed out at his sister and her husband Prince Harry in the most brutal interview he has ever given.
So now we have a birth year that may not align and an education timeline that may not exist. And in between those gaps, those missing, unexplained years, there's something else. Something no one can fully verify, but no one can fully dismiss either. Because multiple voices from inside the family start pointing toward a secret so explosive it doesn't just challenge the story, it rewrites it.
You know, it's just very bizarre how she just basically brushed the entire family under the carpet like we don't exist, and then lied about not having a family and lied about she doesn't have a family that she's always wanted. You know, we've always been
a child, not rumored by tabloids, not invented online, but referenced quietly, repeatedly by people who were there. a daughter, allegedly born when she was barely out of her teens. And if that's true, if even a fraction of that is true, then everything she later presented to the world about motherhood, about first experiences, about life-changing moments becomes something else entirely. Not lies, perhaps, but omissions, strategic silence. And silence is where this story thrives. Because while the public was being sold a narrative of struggle, of auditions, of small roles, of barely making ends meet, something else was happening behind the scenes. Not rumors, not speculation, photographs, real ones, places that don't open their doors to struggling actresses, yachts in Monaco, private decks in Croatia, elite circles where access isn't earned through auditions, it's granted through connections. And here's the unsettling part: no one can explain how she got there. No clear income stream, no documented path, just presence. Consistent, undeniable presence in spaces that operate on invitation only. And invitations like that don't come randomly. They come from power, from influence, from relationships that are never publicly defined. So which version is real? The struggling actress barely surviving in Los Angeles, or the woman quietly navigating some of the most exclusive circles in the world? Because both timelines cannot exist at the same time. One cancels the other out. And yet, no one addresses it. Not directly, not clearly, just silence. Carefully maintained silence. Meanwhile, the people closest to her, those who knew her before the spotlight, start speaking. Not loudly at first, just enough to be heard. A brother watching patterns. A sister noticing inconsistencies. A father remembering details that don't match the official version. None of them aligned, none of them rehearsed, but all of them pointing in the same direction. And that's where it becomes impossible to ignore, because coincidence has a limit, and this story crossed it a long time ago. Now, the question isn't whether something is off. The question is how much of it has been hidden in plain sight this entire time. And just when you think the timeline couldn't get any darker, couldn't get any more tangled, it shifts again, this time away from numbers and into behavior. Because patterns don't just live in dates, they live in decisions. Who gets cut off? Who gets pulled closer? Who suddenly disappears the moment they no longer serve a purpose? And if you listen closely, if you follow the trail left behind by the people who were once inside that circle, a very specific pattern begins to form. A pattern of elevation followed by erasure. This is where the story stops being about confusion and starts becoming about control. Because relationships, according to multiple voices from her past, weren't built, they were leveraged. People came into her life at very specific moments, often when they could offer something: access, connections, credibility, and just as quickly they were gone. Not drifted apart, not naturally distanced, cut, clean, immediate, like a switch flipped off. One moment they existed, the next they were erased from the narrative entirely. And that pattern didn't just apply to friends or acquaintances, it extended to family, which is where things become almost impossible to ignore, because family isn't supposed to follow transactional rules. Yet here, over and over again, we see the same thing: distance, silence, absence. A father who once proudly funded everything, supported everything, stood at the center of her early life, suddenly becomes unreachable. Not publicly attacked, not openly confronted, just removed, quietly. Completely. Think about that. Not one moment, not one misunderstanding, but multiple critical moments. A heart attack, a stroke, a major medical emergency that changed everything. And each time, silence. No visible attempt to reconnect. No emotional public response. Just carefully managed distance. And the question starts to grow louder: how does someone go from being the most important figure in your life to someone who doesn't even get a phone call? Because that isn't just distance, that's a decision. And when decisions like that happen repeatedly, they stop being exceptions. They become a pattern. Meanwhile, while one side of the family fades into silence, another side steps forward, calm, composed, perfectly positioned in the public eye. And that contrast, it's impossible not to notice. Because while one parent is described as complicated, messy, inconvenient, the other is presented as stable, dignified, almost untouchable. But even here, the cracks start to show if you look closely enough. Because behind the calm exterior, behind the carefully controlled appearances, there are whispers of something else. A business, a structure, something operating quietly away from cameras but tied directly to the same name, the same influence, the same credibility that comes from royal association. And what makes it unsettling isn't just what it is, but how it operates. No transparency, no clear paper trail, just access. Access to vulnerable individuals. Access built on trust that may not have been earned, but assumed. And once again, we're back to the same core question: who benefits from this silence? Because silence isn't empty. Silence protects something. It shields something. It keeps certain details from ever being fully examined. And the more silence you see in a story like this, the more you have to ask what exactly is being avoided. But then comes the most unsettling shift of all, the one that takes everything we've heard so far, the timeline inconsistencies, the unexplained years, the fractured family dynamics, and pushes it into something even more difficult to process. Because now we're not just questioning the past, we're questioning the most personal parts of the story, the parts that were presented as undeniable truth, motherhood, identity, legacy. Because once again, multiple voices, unconnected, uncoordinated, start raising the same questions, quietly at first, then louder, about timelines that don't quite align, about details that were never fully clarified, about moments that were presented with emotion, but without the kind of transparency you would expect from something so significant. And here's where it becomes almost impossible to separate fact from narrative. Because when something is real, truly real, it doesn't need layers of protection. It doesn't need controlled access. It doesn't need carefully managed appearances. It simply exists, naturally, clearly, openly. But in this case, everything feels filtered, controlled, distant. Even the introductions, even the moments that should have been raw, human, undeniable. Instead, they felt staged, limited, just enough to be seen, but never enough to be examined. And that gap, that space between what was shown and what was withheld, that's where the questions live. And the people who were once dismissed, once labeled as bitter, irrelevant, unreliable, they're still there, still speaking, still pointing to the same inconsistencies they pointed to years ago. And what's unsettling isn't just what they're saying, it's how much of it has slowly started to align with reality over time. Because predictions that once sounded outrageous no longer feel impossible. And that's when the story changes completely. Because now it's not about whether these voices should be believed blindly. It's about why so many of their claims keep circling back into relevance. Why patterns they described years ago are now visible to everyone. Why the narrative that was once airtight now feels fragile. And right at the center of it all is one undeniable fact: there are too many unanswered questions. Too many gaps that have never been properly addressed. Too many moments where silence replaced clarity. And then comes the final shift. The one that turns everything from speculation into anticipation. A book, not a rumor, not a leak, a direct account from someone who claims to have seen everything unfold in real time. Someone who has already made claims in the past that were dismissed only to later be reconsidered. And now, that same person is preparing to lay out names, events, timelines, not vague suggestions, but specifics. And here's the part that should make anyone pause. If everything so far has been wrong, then this book will collapse instantly. But if even part of it is right, then the entire narrative changes. Because truth doesn't need volume, it needs consistency. And consistency is exactly what keeps appearing in the most unexpected places in this story. So now the tension isn't about what has already been said. It's about what's coming next. Because once those details are out, once those timelines are laid side by side, once those contradictions are impossible to ignore, there will only be two options left. Either everything we've been told holds up under scrutiny, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then this wasn't just a story that was misunderstood. It was a story that was rewritten. And the people who were there from the beginning, the ones who were pushed aside, ignored, erased, they might have been telling the truth all along, or at least a version of it that was never meant to be heard. And if that's the case, then this story isn't over. It's just finally starting to unravel.